The morning sun had barely risen, casting a pale golden light over the quiet suburban streets. Sam Parker, an experienced school bus driver, pulled up to the usual stop, watching his children, some still rubbing the sleep from their eyes, climbed aboard. The engine hummed steadily, a familiar rhythm to his years of driving, but something about this morning felt different. Just as he was about to close the doors, a blur of motion in the distance caught his eye. A little girl, no older than 8, was sprinting toward the bus. Her small feet slapped against the pavement, her oversized backpack bouncing with each frantic step. Her thin arms pumped desperately at her sides, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. Even before she reached the bus, Sam could see the terror in her wide, tear-filled eyes. He frowned, his instincts instantly on high alert. As she reached the bus, she stumbled slightly but caught herself, gripping the railing with trembling fingers. Her tiny hands clung so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She was out of breath, her chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven heaves. Her lips quivered, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "He said he'd hurt me." Sam felt a chill crawl down his spine. The words were spoken with a raw, desperate fear that made his stomach tighten. He crouched down, lowering himself to her level, careful to keep his voice calm despite the unease clawing at his chest. "Who, sweetheart? Who said that?" he asked gently, searching her tear-streaked face for answers. The girl, Delilah Carter, flinched at his voice, as if expecting pain to follow. The reaction made his heart ache. "It's okay," he assured her, his voice softer now. "You're safe here." But she didn't look convinced. Instead, she hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to come running after her. Her breathing remained uneven, her small body still trembling from either exhaustion or fear, or both. Sam took a deep breath, resisting the urge to press her for more details. She was already terrified, the last thing she needed was to feel cornered. The other children had gone silent, their usual morning chatter replaced by hushed whispers. They watched with wide, curious eyes, but none of them spoke. Sensing that she needed space, Sam gently ushered Delilah into the front seat. As she slid into the chair, she curled into herself, hugging her backpack as if it were a shield. Her hands gripped the straps so tightly that her fingers turned red. Sam sat back in his seat, his mind racing. Something was wrong, very wrong. After a moment of silence, he tried again. "Delilah, can you tell me what happened?" She didn't answer right away. Her teeth sank into her lower lip, her gaze fixed on the floor. Then, with slow, hesitant movements, she pulled up the sleeves of her sweater. Sam's breath caught. Dark bruises, deep, finger-shaped marks, circled her wrists. The sight sent a wave of anger through him, hot and searing, but he forced himself to stay calm. She didn't need to see his fury, she needed comfort, safety. "All right," he said, keeping his voice even despite the storm raging inside him. "I promise you, we're going to help you. You're not alone anymore." Delilah's eyes searched his face, as if weighing whether or not to believe him. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she gave a tiny, hesitant nod. As soon as the bus arrived at school, Sam wasted no time. He spotted Miss Hall, the school counselor, standing near the entrance and quickly pulled her aside. His voice was low but urgent as he explained what had happened. Miss Hall's expression darkened as she listened. Without hesitation, she knelt beside Delilah, her voice gentle but firm. "Sweetheart, will you come with me? We're going to make sure you're safe." Delilah hesitated, her small fingers tightening around her backpack straps. But when she glanced up at Sam, he gave her a reassuring nod. Slowly, she let Miss Hall take her hand, her movements uncertain but trusting. And that was the moment everything began to unravel. An investigation was launched. Authorities were called. And the truth that emerged shook the entire town. Delilah had been living in constant fear under the hands of her own father, Todd Carter, a man who had carefully hidden his cruelty behind the mask of a devoted single parent. Neighbors had seen him as hard-working, polite, even charming. But behind closed doors, he was a monster. Worse yet, as detectives dug deeper, they uncovered a chilling truth: Delilah's mother, Sarah Carter, had mysteriously vanished months earlier. At the time, Todd had claimed she had left them, abandoning her family without a trace. But now, with new evidence surfacing, the police weren't so sure. Interviews were conducted. Delilah's bruises were documented. And when she finally found the courage to speak, her testimony revealed horrors no child should ever endure. She spoke of nights spent locked in the basement, of harsh words and cruel hands. Of a father who controlled every aspect of her life through fear. And of a mother who had fought back, only to disappear. When authorities confronted Todd Carter, he denied everything. He spun lies, weaving stories of a troubled wife who had walked out and a child prone to exaggeration. But the evidence spoke louder than his words. Blood stains. Hidden documents. And a backyard that, when searched, revealed the horrifying fate of Sarah Carter. The case made headlines. Todd Carter was arrested, charged not only with child abuse but with something far worse. And as justice took its course, Delilah, though forever scarred by her past, was finally safe. She was placed with a foster family who treated her with kindness, patience, and love. At first, she flinched at sudden movements, shrank away from loud voices. But slowly, ever so slowly, she began to heal. She still had nightmares, still woke up some nights in a cold sweat, the ghosts of her past refusing to let go. But she was no longer alone. Because people like Sam Parker, Miss Hall, and the social workers who fought for her refused to let her be forgotten. For the first time in a long, long time, Delilah had hope. Despite being in a safe environment now, Delilah's wounds, both physical and emotional, ran deep. Her foster mother, Mrs. Thompson, was a kind and patient woman, but she quickly noticed the signs of Delilah's trauma. The little girl flinched at sudden movements, avoided eye contact, and barely spoke unless spoken to. She refused to sleep with the lights off, and any unexpected noise would send her into a panic. At school, her teachers were gentle with her, but they, too, noticed the subtle signs. She rarely played with other children, sitting quietly at the edge of the playground, watching but never joining. During lessons, she stared at her desk, hands folded neatly in her lap as if bracing for something bad to happen. One afternoon, Miss Hall, the school counselor, gently sat down next to her during recess. "Would you like to draw with me?" she asked, sliding a blank sheet of paper and a box of crayons toward her. Delilah hesitated but eventually picked up a crayon. Her small fingers trembled slightly as she drew slow, careful lines. At first, it was just shapes, circles, squares, random patterns. But then, her strokes became more deliberate. She drew a house, a small figure in a window, and a dark figure looming outside. Miss Hall felt her chest tighten. "Delilah," she asked softly, "can you tell me about your drawing?" Delilah's grip on the crayon tightened. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, in a barely audible voice, she whispered, "He used to lock me in the basement." Miss Hall's heart broke. She had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed from Delilah's own lips was a different kind of pain. "You're safe now," Miss Hall reassured her, fighting back her own emotions. "No one will ever hurt you again." But Delilah only nodded absently, as if she wanted to believe it but wasn't sure she could. As the days passed, Delilah started to open up more. Small moments of trust began to surface, reaching for Mrs. Thompson's hand during thunderstorms, whispering a quiet thank you when given a warm cup of cocoa before bed. But there were still nights when she woke up screaming, drenched in sweat, the shadows of her past gripping her like cold chains. Mrs. Thompson, determined to help her heal, contacted a child psychologist who specialized in trauma cases. Dr. Emily Lawson met with Delilah twice a week, using art, storytelling, and gentle conversation to guide her through the pain. At first, Delilah was hesitant, reluctant to speak. She had spent so long believing that no one would listen, that speaking out only led to punishment. But Dr. Lawson was patient. She never pushed, never rushed. She simply created a space where Delilah could feel safe. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, Delilah hesitated before leaving the office. She turned back to Dr. Lawson, her voice small but steady. "Can I help other kids like me?" Dr. Lawson smiled gently. "One day, sweetheart, you absolutely can." And that was the beginning of Delilah's healing. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was a survivor, slowly reclaiming the life that had been stolen from her. Healing wasn't easy. There were setbacks, days where the fear returned, where the memories clawed their way back into her mind like unwelcome intruders. But with time, Delilah grew stronger. She started speaking more in class, answering questions with a quiet but certain voice. She made a friend, a girl named Hannah, who never asked about her past but always offered a seat next to her at lunch. Mrs. Thompson enrolled her in a self-defense class, not because she wanted Delilah to fight, but because she wanted her to feel strong. To know that she wasn't helpless anymore. The first few sessions were terrifying. The idea of someone grabbing her, even in practice, sent her into panic. But with gentle encouragement, she learned to stand her ground. To push back. To say no. Years later, Delilah kept that promise to herself. She became an advocate for children suffering from abuse, speaking at schools, supporting victims, and working with organizations to provide resources for those in need. Because she knew firsthand what it was like to be trapped in the darkness. And she vowed to be the light for others who needed it. Even though Delilah was now in a safe home, the fear never truly left her. It clung to her like a shadow, creeping into her thoughts when she least expected it. Some nights, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, afraid that if she closed her eyes, she would wake up back in that dark basement. Mrs. Thompson did everything she could to make her feel safe, leaving a nightlight on, keeping her bedroom door slightly open, checking on her before bed. But the fear was deeply rooted, a constant reminder of the horrors she had endured. Then, one evening, as Mrs. Thompson was tucking her in, Delilah grabbed her sleeve, her small fingers trembling. "Will he come back for me?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mrs. Thompson's heart ached. She knelt beside Delilah, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No, sweetheart. He can't hurt you anymore. I promise." Delilah searched her face for reassurance, wanting so badly to believe her. But the nightmares said otherwise. The bruises, though faded, still ached. The memories still lingered. Mrs. Thompson knew that no amount of comforting words would erase Delilah's past, but she also knew something had to be done. The very next morning, she contacted Detective Samuel Carter, a seasoned investigator who had handled many child abuse cases before. When he arrived at the house, he was careful not to overwhelm Delilah. He sat with her at the kitchen table, his voice calm and steady. "Delilah, I know this is hard," he said gently. "But I need to know what happened so I can make sure he never hurts anyone again. You don't have to say anything you're not ready for, okay?" Delilah hesitated, gripping the edge of her chair. A war raged inside her, fear, shame, doubt. What if he found out she had spoken? What if he came back, angrier than before? But then she looked at Mrs. Thompson, who gave her a reassuring nod. She thought about Miss Hall, Dr. Lawson, the people who had been kind to her. She swallowed hard and took a deep breath. He locked me in the basement," she whispered, her voice shaking. When I cried, he told me no one would come. That no one cared. Detective Carter remained still, his expression unreadable, but his eyes were filled with quiet determination. You're very brave, Delilah. I believe you. And I promise you, we'll make sure he never does this again. Uncovering the truth. Detective Carter and his team began gathering evidence, revisiting the reports that had been filed when Delilah was first rescued. They interviewed neighbors, checked records, and pieced together the horrors she had suffered. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became, Delilah's abuser had a history of violence. Whispers of past victims, children who had been too afraid to speak, surfaced. But Delilah's testimony was a turning point. She had broken the silence. As the case gained traction, Mrs. Thompson shielded Delilah from most of it, but the little girl could sense the change. The tension in the house, the whispered conversations, the phone calls late into the evening. Then, one day, she overheard Mrs. Thompson on the phone. They found him, she said, her voice tight with emotion. He's been arrested. Delilah's breath caught in her throat. Her hands clenched into fists. She wanted to feel relieved, to believe it was over. But fear still gripped her. What if he got out? What if he came back? That night, she curled up in bed, staring at the night light flickering softly in the corner. She wanted to believe she was safe. That the monster was gone. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. Detective Samuel Carter had handled countless cases of abuse and violence, but something about this one unsettled him more than usual. The evidence against the primary suspect was overwhelming. Delilah's abuser was behind bars, awaiting trial. The case should have been closed, but a nagging feeling in the detective's gut told him that there was more to the story. Someone else had been involved. Someone who had watched from the shadows, unnoticed. That's when the name Todd Carter surfaced. Todd was the younger brother of the man arrested, and while his record was clean, there were whispers about him, stories that never made it to official reports but circulated among those who had reason to fear him. A few neighbors recalled seeing him loitering near the house where Delilah had been kept. A store clerk remembered him purchasing supplies late at night, paying in cash, avoiding eye contact. At first, there had been no direct link between Todd and the crime. But then, Detective Carter noticed something strange: Todd's reaction to his brother's arrest. Most family members either denied everything, insisting their loved one was innocent, or broke down in shock. Todd did neither. Instead, he had strolled into the police station the day after his brother's arrest, hands in his pockets, a lazy smirk on his lips. He leaned against the counter and casually asked, "So, how long do you think he'll get?" Detective Carter, who had been nearby, turned sharply at the comment. "That's a strange question to ask," he said, watching Todd closely. Todd shrugged. "Not really. I mean, you got him, right? Just wondering how bad it'll be for him." There was no urgency in his voice, no distress. Just cold curiosity. As if he had already accepted the outcome. The detective's instincts went on high alert. He decided to watch Todd more closely, and soon, unsettling patterns began to emerge. A week later, Mrs. Thompson, Delilah's temporary guardian, called in a report. "There's a man who's been hanging around," she said, her voice filled with unease. "I didn't think much of it at first, but he's been outside my house twice this week. Just standing there." When she described the man, Detective Carter's stomach tightened. Todd. The next day, Carter pulled Todd's phone records. His official statement claimed he hadn't spoken to his brother in months, yet the call log showed otherwise: numerous late-night calls between the two in the weeks leading up to the arrest. Some calls lasted only a few seconds, others stretched for nearly an hour. More witnesses came forward. A gas station attendant remembered Todd stopping by frequently, always paying in cash, buying items that seemed strange. Rope, duct tape, cleaning supplies. At the time, the clerk hadn't thought much of it. Now, in the context of the case, it painted a disturbing picture. Then came the final confirmation. Detective Carter sat down with Delilah, carefully introducing a photo of Todd among others. He watched her face closely. The moment her eyes landed on his image, her breath caught. Her fingers clenched the fabric of her sweater, knuckles turning white. "Him," she whispered. Mrs. Thompson placed a reassuring hand on Delilah's shoulder. "Sweetheart, do you recognize him?" Delilah swallowed hard. She hesitated, as if afraid to speak. Finally, she nodded. I heard his voice," she murmured. "Sometimes, when I was in the basement. He was there." He talked to him. A heavy silence filled the room. Detective Carter felt a cold chill creep up his spine. This wasn't just a coincidence. Todd hadn't just known about the abuse, he had been there. He had spoken to his brother while Delilah was locked away, suffering. Mrs. Thompson covered her mouth, horrified. Detective Carter set the photograph down, his jaw tightening. Todd Carter wasn't just an innocent bystander. He was part of the nightmare Delilah had endured. And now, they had to prove it. The tension in the air was palpable as Detective Samuel Carter stood in his office, his eyes fixed on the warrant in his hand. His knuckles tightened around the paper, the weight of its significance sinking in. It had taken weeks of painstaking investigation, hours spent poring over evidence, interviewing witnesses, and following dead-end leads, but now they had it. The legal authority to search Todd Carter's home. The document was crisp, freshly signed, but it felt heavier than it should. This was the moment they had been waiting for. The walls of suspicion that had surrounded Todd for so long were about to come crumbling down, but Carter knew better than to assume the search would be straightforward. This wasn't just a search for evidence, it was a search for a twisted truth, a truth that had eluded them for far too long. Detective Laura Bennett, his trusted partner, stood by the door, her face a mixture of calm resolve and anticipation. Her arms were crossed, her gaze fixed on him, waiting for the next move. Carter didn't need to speak, she knew what was coming. He could feel the weight of her gaze, but it didn't unsettle him. It gave him strength. "Everything's ready," she said quietly, her voice a steadying presence in the silence of the room. "We've got the team waiting outside." "Let's move," Carter replied, his voice low but firm. He could hear the quiet urgency in his words, a reflection of the fire burning inside him. This case was personal now. It wasn't just about finding the truth, it was about ensuring that justice was done, no matter the cost. They left the office, and Carter couldn't shake the feeling that something, some hidden detail, was just on the cusp of being revealed. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end as they piled into the squad car. The hum of the engine was a constant reminder of the importance of what lay ahead. They sped through the streets, the buildings flashing by in a blur as Carter's mind raced. Each passing moment only fueled the urgency of their mission. As the car approached Todd's house, Carter couldn't help but glance at the place that had long been a symbol of suspicion. It was a modest two-story home, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. To the casual observer, it appeared nothing out of the ordinary. But Carter knew better. Beneath the surface of suburban normalcy lay a darkness that was only now beginning to surface. The house sat in silence, the kind of silence that seemed unnatural. There was no sign of movement inside, no lights flickering behind the windows. It was almost as if Todd had anticipated their arrival and had made himself scarce. Carter clenched his jaw. He wasn't about to let Todd slip through his fingers again. "We goin' fast, we goin' smart," Carter said, his voice cutting through the tension. His team nodded in unison, ready for action. They split up, each moving to different entry points. Carter and Bennett made their way to the front door, and the detective's hand hovered over the handle for a brief moment. He exchanged a quick glance with Bennett, who gave him a small nod. He knew she was as ready as he was. With a quick turn of the handle, the door creaked open, the sound of it slicing through the thick silence. Carter's heart pounded in his chest as they stepped inside, the smell of dust and stale air hitting them immediately. The house felt cold, eerily still, as if it were holding its breath. Clear upstairs, came a voice from one of the officers on the second floor. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly as the team began their sweep of the house. Carter's eyes scanned the living room. It was pristine, perhaps too pristine. There were no personal touches, no family photos or mementos. Just a stark, empty space. The kind of emptiness that sent an unsettling chill up his spine. "Check everything," Carter ordered, his voice low but forceful. "Nothing gets overlooked." Bennett moved toward a small desk in the corner of the room, her eyes narrowing as she opened the drawer. A folder caught her attention immediately. She pulled it out, and as soon as her eyes scanned the label, Carter's stomach dropped. The word "confidential" was stamped in bold red letters across the top. He moved toward her, his steps quick but measured. Bennett slid the folder open, her fingers shaking slightly as she flipped through the contents. The first few pages were filled with notes, cryptic scribbles that made Carter's stomach churn. But it was the photographs that caught his attention. There, in black and white, were pictures of Delilah, some taken inside the house, others in places that Carter couldn't immediately recognize. His pulse quickened. These weren't just photos. They were evidence. Proof that Todd had been involved in something far worse than anyone had suspected. One photograph in particular stood out. It was a close-up shot of Delilah's face, taken in a moment of fear, her eyes wide and haunted. A single tear ran down her cheek, and Carter could almost feel the despair emanating from the image. He swallowed hard, fighting the surge of anger that welled up inside him. This was not just a case. This was a crime that went far beyond what he had ever imagined. Bennett continued to flip through the folder, each page revealing more damning evidence. Handwritten notes, dates, times, cryptic messages. "She's almost ready," one of the notes said. "Just a little longer, and she'll be perfect." The words sent a jolt of revulsion through Carter. He clenched his fists, trying to control the overwhelming rage threatening to bubble to the surface. The search continued, and Carter's team began uncovering more items hidden throughout the house: ropes, duct tape, a syringe, and other tools that sent a wave of dread through the detective. It wasn't just physical abuse. Todd had been planning something far more sinister, and now, the evidence was staring them in the face. They weren't just dealing with a case of neglect or manipulation. This was something darker, something that sent a chill to the very core of Carter's being. In a locked cabinet in the basement, they found a journal, one that Carter immediately recognized as Todd's handwriting. He flipped it open, each page revealing more details about Delilah's captivity, about her scheduled readiness, and about Todd's twisted obsession with her. One entry, dated only a few weeks before her rescue, sent a shiver down Carter's spine. "She's almost mine. Soon, she'll be perfect." The detective's hands shook as he turned the pages, the weight of the discovery sinking in. This wasn't just about a victim anymore. This was about stopping a monster, a man who had used his power and influence to manipulate and control for far too long. "We have everything we need," Bennett said quietly, her voice filled with a mix of exhaustion and relief. Carter nodded, his heart still racing. They had the evidence now, the undeniable proof that Todd Carter was responsible for the torment Delilah had endured. But there was one thing left unanswered. Where was Todd? Carter's gut tightened as the realization hit him. Todd knew they were coming. He had been expecting this moment, planning for it. And now, the man they were after was nowhere to be found. Todd had made his move. He was on the run. Carter's jaw clenched, his hands balled into fists at his sides. The fight was far from over. But now, with the evidence in hand, he was more determined than ever to track Todd down. The twisted man who had hurt Delilah would pay for his crimes. Carter wouldn't stop until he was brought to justice, no matter where Todd had gone or how far he was willing to run. The courtroom was tense as Detective Carter watched from the back, his eyes fixed on the witness stand. The former nanny, a woman named Claire Hamilton, was being sworn in. She had worked for the Carter family for several years before leaving under what appeared to be unusual circumstances. Her testimony was one of the last pieces in this complex puzzle, and Carter could feel the weight of the moment. Claire was nervous, her hands trembling as she gripped the edges of the stand. She avoided eye contact with the jury, her gaze darting between the attorneys and the floor. The scars of her past, which had been hidden for so long, were now coming to the surface. Her voice quivered as she spoke, and Carter could see the deep conflict in her eyes. She had been a part of Todd Carter's world for far too long, and now, standing before the court, she had to make a choice: protect herself or finally tell the truth, no matter how painful. "Claire," the prosecutor, Thomas Alden, asked, his voice gentle but firm, "please tell the court about your experience working for the Carter family." Claire hesitated, her breath catching in her throat as she glanced up at Todd Carter, who sat in the defendant's chair with an unreadable expression. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, Carter could see the flicker of something dangerous in his gaze. He didn't want her to speak, not the truth. But Claire had made her decision, and now there was no going back. I worked for them for almost 5 years, Claire began, her voice shaky but determined. At first, it was just a normal job. Todd seemed like a good man, charming, generous, someone you'd want to work for. But over time, things changed. She swallowed hard, as if the words themselves were painful to say. "What kind of changes?" Alden pressed, his voice soft, trying to coax her through the difficult recollections. Claire hesitated again, her eyes flicking nervously to the defense table, where Todd sat. She could feel his presence like a heavy weight pressing against her chest. But she took a deep breath, knowing that this was her chance to speak up, to release the burden that had been suffocating her for years. He started to act different with Delilah, she finally admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. It was subtle at first. Little things, like the way he'd look at her, or how he'd talk to her when he thought no one was around. But then it got worse. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she squeezed her eyes shut, trying to hold back the flood of emotions that threatened to overtake her. "How did it get worse?" Alden pressed, his tone still gentle, but his eyes hardening as he realized the gravity of the situation. Claire took a deep, shaky breath before answering. He started isolating her more. Delilah would spend more time in her room, and Todd would keep her away from the other staff and even from the family. He would say it was because she needed extra attention, that she was fragile, but I knew it was more than that. I saw the way he'd touch her, the way his eyes would follow her movements. It was wrong. And I knew I had to leave before it got worse. Her hands trembled, and for a moment, she had to steady herself before continuing. But even after I left, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I knew I had to tell someone. But I was scared. Detective Carter, standing in the back of the courtroom, clenched his fists. His heart pounded in his chest as he listened to Claire's testimony. He had suspected, but hearing it all laid bare was a different experience. His jaw tightened as he thought of Delilah, how she had been isolated, manipulated, and controlled for so long. How Todd had used his power over her, and how Claire had known the truth but had been too afraid to act on it. "What made you come forward now?" Alden asked, breaking Carter's thoughts. Claire's gaze finally shifted, meeting the prosecutor's eyes. There was a moment of silence before she spoke, her voice raw with emotion. "I saw Delilah in the news. I saw what had happened to her, how she had finally gotten away. And I realized that if I didn't speak up, no one else would. If I kept silent, I was just as guilty as he was. The room was quiet. Carter could see the guilt in Claire's eyes, the shame she carried for not speaking sooner, but he also saw the courage it had taken for her to finally break her silence. She wasn't the same scared woman who had left the Carter household in secret. No, this Claire was different. She was stronger now. And though her testimony had been difficult, it was the final piece needed to expose Todd Carter for who he truly was. Todd's expression remained stoic, but Carter noticed the subtle shift in his demeanor. His hands clenched tightly in his lap, his jaw tightening as if trying to hold on to control. But it was too late. The cracks in his carefully constructed facade were beginning to show. Claire's testimony had done more than just reveal Todd's actions. It had opened a door to the truth, one that Carter had been desperately trying to uncover for months. Now, with this evidence on the record, the case against Todd Carter was stronger than ever. As Claire finished her testimony, Carter could see her shoulders sag with the weight of her words. She had finally done it. She had spoken the truth, and in doing so, she had helped bring justice closer to Delilah. The room was still, the air thick with the gravity of what had just been revealed. Carter took a deep breath, his mind already working, calculating the next steps. There was no turning back now. Todd would pay for what he had done, no matter how far he had gone to hide it. Claire's courage had been the final key in unlocking the truth, and Carter would ensure that Todd Carter's twisted reign of terror came to an end. The detective knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but one thing was certain: Delilah's tormentor was finally going to face justice. And Carter, driven by the memories of the young girl's pain, would make sure of it. The courtroom had barely recovered from Claire Hamilton's emotional testimony when Todd Carter's defense team sprang into action, determined to shift the tide in his favor. As Claire had left the stand, visibly drained, Todd remained calm, too calm. His cold, calculating gaze never left her as she exited the courtroom, and the subtle smirk playing at the corner of his lips sent a chill down Detective Carter's spine. He was a master manipulator, and it was clear he wasn't about to go down without a fight. Outside the courtroom, Todd had already begun his next move. As soon as the day's proceedings had wrapped up, his legal team held a press conference, carefully crafted to sway public opinion. The media flocked to him, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions. Todd stood tall, his expression one of controlled concern as he adjusted his suit, every move deliberate, every word carefully chosen. He had perfected the art of looking like the victim, and now he was going to use it to his advantage. "People are quick to judge," Todd began, his voice calm but carrying an air of righteousness. "I understand that, given the charges against me, many have already made up their minds. But I want to make one thing clear: I have always been a loving father, a committed husband, and a man who would never harm a child." Carter, who had been watching the press conference from a nearby monitor, clenched his fists. He knew exactly what Todd was doing. With every word, he was painting himself as the wronged man, the misunderstood father whose reputation had been smeared by the lies of those who wished to see him fall. It was classic Todd. He always had a way of making himself appear as the hero in every story. Todd's gaze swept over the reporters, his eyes glistening with a mix of guilt and arrogance. "I love my daughter more than anything in this world," he continued, his tone dropping slightly, as if he were sharing some painful secret with the world. "But now I'm being accused of something unspeakable, something I could never do. These lies are tearing my family apart. I have to fight for my name, for my reputation, and for the truth to come out." As Todd spoke, Carter could see the flicker of calculated emotion in his eyes. The tears he pretended to wipe away, the trembling hands that gripped the podium, they were all part of the show. The man had a sickening ability to manipulate the public, and he knew exactly how to play on their sympathies. Behind the scenes, his legal team worked tirelessly to ensure that the narrative remained in his favor. They emphasized Todd's charitable work, his dedication to the community, and the numerous awards he had received for his business achievements. All of these were presented as evidence of his good character, as if they could somehow erase the damning truth behind the allegations. As the reporters pounced on each carefully staged statement, Todd continued to play the part of the victim with expert precision. He knew the public would be swayed by his charisma, by his image as a successful businessman and family man. He knew how to twist the narrative, to make the accusations against him seem like a personal vendetta, a smear campaign orchestrated by those who had something to gain from his downfall. But what infuriated Carter the most was Todd's ability to manipulate the emotions of his daughter, Delilah. He painted himself as the concerned father, heartbroken by the damage being done to his family. Yet, Carter knew the truth. He knew the things Todd had done behind closed doors, the way he had twisted Delilah's innocence to serve his own sick needs. To see Todd twist the narrative into a story of his own victimhood was infuriating. As the press conference concluded, Todd walked away from the podium, his head held high, his expression one of defiance. The media buzzed with questions, but he was already in his car, leaving the scene with his team, his face unchanged. He knew that this performance was far from over. He had only just begun to play his hand. The following days were filled with a whirlwind of media coverage, interviews, and public statements from Todd's supporters. He had a loyal following, many of whom were blind to the darkness hiding behind his polished exterior. They rallied behind him, repeating his words as if they were gospel, convinced that he was the victim in this twisted tale. But for Carter, watching Todd's public manipulation unfold felt like watching a train wreck in slow motion. The detective could see through the lies, and he was certain that, eventually, the truth would catch up to Todd. Yet, as each day passed, the pressure mounted. With every word Todd spoke, every carefully crafted public appearance, the case seemed to slip further out of Carter's grasp. Inside the courtroom, things were growing more complicated. Todd's defense had begun to chip away at the testimony, casting doubt on the credibility of witnesses and even questioning the integrity of the investigation. Carter felt the heat intensifying, but he refused to let Todd win. He knew this wasn't just about winning a case, it was about exposing Todd for the monster he truly was. Todd's manipulations weren't just confined to the media. Inside the courtroom, he was doing everything in his power to intimidate and discredit the people who had come forward with the truth. He would glance at Claire Hamilton with a cold, calculating look whenever her name was mentioned. He would send subtle, threatening gestures toward those who dared to speak out. For Detective Carter, this battle was personal. His determination grew with every new tactic Todd employed. Todd may have the public on his side for now, but Carter would make sure that the truth came to light. It was only a matter of time before Todd's manipulation unraveled, and Carter would be there, ready to expose it for what it was, one final lie in a long string of deceit. As the case continued to unfold, Carter's resolve only grew stronger. He would not let Todd's public manipulation distract him from the mission at hand. The detective knew that the only thing that mattered now was bringing Todd to justice, no matter how many public performances or false narratives he spun. The truth had a way of coming to light, and Carter would make sure it did. Detective Carter's pulse quickened as he stood outside the courthouse, reviewing the files that had been recently handed over by his team. The new evidence they had uncovered in the past few days, though circumstantial, was undeniable. A series of incriminating text messages between Todd Carter and various accomplices, financial records detailing large withdrawals made under suspicious circumstances, and, most damning of all, a hidden storage unit filled with items that directly linked him to the abuse. It was enough to shake Carter to his core. The detective knew that this was the turning point. The weight of the evidence felt heavy in his hands, and yet, it also carried a sense of grim relief. Todd had been able to manipulate the public, cast doubt on the investigation, and turn the tables to his advantage. But this time, the truth was undeniable. The evidence was stacked against him. There was no more room for lies, no more room for manipulation. The truth was now inescapable. Carter's thoughts were interrupted by a call. It was his partner, Detective Mason. "We've got the warrant. We're moving in on him." Mason's voice was tight with tension, but there was also an underlying sense of determination. Carter could hear the hurried footsteps in the background, the sound of other officers preparing to make their move. They were going after Todd Carter now, and it was no longer a question of if, but when. Carter's hand tightened around the phone. "Do it," he said, voice steady despite the rush of emotions building up inside him. He had been waiting for this moment for what felt like an eternity. Todd had spun a web of lies, one thread at a time, and Carter had been unraveling it all along. Now, they had him. As Carter made his way to the address where Todd was staying, his thoughts swirled. The man he had been chasing for months was about to be taken down, but Carter couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his gut. He had seen Todd's cold, calculating nature up close. Todd had a way of slipping through the cracks, of evading justice. He wasn't about to let his guard down now. This was a high-stakes operation, and Carter knew that one wrong move could send everything crashing down. When they arrived, Carter could see Todd's car parked in the driveway. The house was quiet, almost eerily so. The blinds were drawn, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. But Carter wasn't fooled. He knew that Todd would be expecting this. Todd was always one step ahead, always ready with a plan to turn the situation in his favor. Carter's heart pounded in his chest as he approached the front door. His team had already surrounded the house, and backup was in place. The moment they made their move, there would be no turning back. He gave a nod to Mason, who was by his side. Together, they approached the door, and Carter's hand hovered over the handle. His breath caught for a moment, the reality of the situation settling in. He wasn't just arresting a man, he was pulling the final thread that would bring Todd Carter's empire of lies crashing down. This was the moment that would put an end to the horror Todd had been inflicting on his daughter, and countless others, for far too long. Mason gave him a sharp look, silently urging him to proceed. Carter turned the handle and kicked the door in with a force that sent it slamming open. The sound echoed through the house, followed by the rapid footfalls of officers entering the premises. Todd's voice rang out from the living room, his tone strangely calm, as if he had been waiting for this moment. "I knew you'd come," he said, the faintest hint of amusement in his voice, though it was tainted with an unmistakable edge of fear. Carter stepped into the living room, his eyes locking onto Todd, who stood in front of the fireplace, as though the whole situation were nothing more than an inconvenience. His hands were raised in mock surrender, but Carter saw through the facade. There was no remorse in Todd's eyes, only a sense of calculated detachment. It was as though Todd still believed he could talk his way out of this, just as he had done with so many others. "You have the right to remain silent," Carter said, his voice firm and unwavering as he stepped forward to place Todd in handcuffs. The words felt hollow coming from him, as if they were somehow inadequate to fully capture the gravity of the moment. But there was no room for hesitation now. Todd's reign of manipulation was over. As the handcuffs clicked shut around Todd's wrists, his expression faltered for the briefest of moments. It was a subtle shift, an imperceptible twitch of his lips, a flicker of fear in his eyes that he quickly masked with a cold, arrogant sneer. But Carter had seen it. For the first time, Todd looked vulnerable. Carter motioned for his team to secure the house, while he took a step closer to Todd. His voice dropped low, but it was heavy with the weight of everything that had led to this point. "This is over, Todd. You can't hide anymore. The truth's out, and you're going to pay for everything you've done." Todd's sneer deepened, but Carter saw the subtle shift in his posture. He was no longer in control. The public manipulation, the lies, the carefully constructed persona, everything was crumbling. The man who had once seemed so untouchable was finally going to face the consequences of his actions. As Todd was led away, Carter stood in the doorway for a moment longer, his mind still racing. It wasn't just about making an arrest, it was about ensuring that the darkness that Todd had concealed for so long would finally be exposed. The road ahead would be difficult, but Carter was certain of one thing: justice had taken its first step. The battle wasn't over yet, but with Todd Carter's arrest, it felt like they were one step closer to ending the nightmare. The evidence was irrefutable, and the truth was no longer a secret. Todd had finally run out of lies. The air in the interrogation room was thick with silence as Detective Carter sat across from Todd, who had been placed in a cold, sterile holding cell for the past few hours. Carter had expected Todd to remain silent, to use his usual tactics of evasion and deflection. But this time, things felt different. The walls had begun to close in on Todd, and he no longer had the power to manipulate the situation the way he once had. Carter could see the subtle changes in his demeanor. His previously confident, almost arrogant posture had slumped slightly, and there was a nervous twitch in his fingers that hadn't been there before. Despite the calm facade Todd was trying to maintain, Carter knew that he was finally feeling the pressure of everything closing in on him. "You're not going to get away with this, Todd," Carter said, his voice low and steady. He leaned forward slightly, eyes never leaving Todd's face, watching for any crack in his armor. "Your daughter, Sarah, she's been through hell. You can pretend all you want, but we know the truth now." Todd's face remained impassive, but Carter saw the flicker in his eyes, the briefest of glances down to his hands before he regained his composure. The detective felt a surge of anger. The man across from him had created a web of lies and manipulation that had trapped his own flesh and blood for years. Sarah had been a victim in this twisted game, and it was Carter's job to make sure she was no longer trapped. Carter stood and paced a few steps, trying to contain his emotions. "The truth is undeniable, Todd. The evidence we have against you, your financial records, the text messages, your interactions with your accomplices, all of it points to one thing. You are responsible for what happened to Sarah. The physical and emotional torment you put her through. We have her testimony. She's ready to speak. The court will hear her story." Todd's jaw clenched, but he remained silent. Carter could see him weighing his options, calculating whether to continue the game of silence or to finally admit what had happened. Then, in a moment of fleeting vulnerability, Todd spoke, his voice low but sharp. "You don't know anything about her. You have no idea what it was like," he spat, his voice trembling for the first time. Carter's heart raced as he locked eyes with Todd, seeing the cracks in his facade deepening. Todd had always been the one in control, the one who pulled the strings and manipulated others into doing his bidding. But now, in this small, sterile room, Todd's control was slipping. And with it, the truth was beginning to come to light. "We know enough," Carter replied firmly. "We know Sarah has been through unimaginable suffering at your hands. But she's finally free. She's out of your grasp now. And she's going to have her day in court. We'll make sure of that." Todd's lips twitched into something resembling a grimace, but he said nothing more. His earlier bravado had faded, replaced by a tight-lipped silence that seemed to scream of resentment and fear. Carter could tell that Todd was running out of defenses. This wasn't the same man who had waltzed into courtrooms and manipulated the media with his charming smile and practiced words. This was a man who had been cornered, caught in his own web of deceit. The door to the interrogation room creaked open, and another officer entered, handing Carter a folder. Carter's eyes scanned the contents quickly: new documents, more confirmation of Sarah's trauma, medical reports, and photographs. They were about to present the final pieces of evidence in court. "This is it," Carter muttered under his breath, barely able to contain the satisfaction that swelled within him. He could feel the weight of the case finally shifting in their favor, as if the burden of the past several months was finally being lifted from his shoulders. Sarah's fate, her suffering, her survival, her strength, had been confirmed. And now, it was Todd's turn to face the consequences. With one last glance at Todd, Carter stood up, motioning for the officers to take him back to his cell. As Todd was escorted out of the room, Carter could sense a final shift in his demeanor, a faint tremor in his hands, a brief look of defeat in his eyes. The man who had once exuded confidence and control now looked like a hollow shell of the person he had once been. For Sarah, this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be difficult, but she would finally have the chance to speak her truth in court. She would no longer be the victim in Todd's story, she would be the one to take control of her fate. And Carter would be there, every step of the way, making sure that Todd Carter's lies and manipulation would be exposed for the world to see. As the door closed behind Todd, Carter's thoughts turned to Sarah once more. She had endured more than anyone should ever have to. But now, with the weight of evidence and the truth behind them, Sarah's fate had been confirmed, and there was no turning back. Todd would be held accountable, and Sarah could finally begin her healing process, free from the shadow of her father's abuse. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed with spectators, reporters, and legal teams. Detective Carter stood near the back, observing the atmosphere with a deep sense of purpose. He had seen countless cases, but there was something profoundly different about this one. It wasn't just the culmination of months of investigation or the mountains of evidence they had gathered against Todd Carter. It was the opportunity for Sarah, the young girl who had suffered in silence for far too long, to finally speak her truth. As the court proceedings began, Carter's gaze flickered towards Sarah, sitting quietly in the witness stand. Her face was calm, but there was an undeniable vulnerability in her eyes, a reflection of the years of pain she had endured. She was no longer the frightened child locked away in her father's world of manipulation and control. Today, she was a young woman ready to reclaim her life. Her decision to testify was not easy. Every word she spoke would open old wounds, but Carter knew it was necessary for her to heal fully. The bravery in her determination was nothing short of remarkable. Todd, sitting on the opposite side of the courtroom, looked every bit the image of a man trying to retain control. His tailored suit seemed too tight around him, as if it couldn't contain the weight of his impending downfall. The once confident air he carried had evaporated, replaced by the cold, defensive silence that now clung to him. Todd's eyes flitted nervously between his lawyer and the judge, but he never once met Sarah's gaze. Perhaps he knew, deep down, that he had lost his grip on everything. The moment Sarah took the stand, Carter felt the energy in the room shift. The tension was palpable, and Carter could hear the soft rustle of people shifting in their seats, waiting for her testimony. Sarah cleared her throat, her voice quivering at first, but as she began to speak, the words gained strength. She recounted everything, the cruelty, the isolation, the moments of fear, and the manipulation she had endured at the hands of the man who should have protected her most. Her voice, though steady now, was laced with the pain of years spent in silence. As Sarah spoke, Carter's heart ached for her. He could see the toll it took on her, the tremors in her hands, the moments when she looked down, almost as if the weight of the truth were too heavy to carry. But despite everything, she was holding her ground. Every word she spoke was a step toward her liberation. In the audience, Carter noticed a few people wiping away tears, some of them reporters who had covered the case, others members of Sarah's extended family, who had no idea about the extent of her suffering until now. The truth was being laid bare, and nothing could hide it anymore. Todd's arrogance, his manipulation, all of it was crumbling in front of the world. As Sarah's testimony came to an end, the defense attorney attempted to undermine her credibility with questions that were designed to create doubt. Todd's lawyer implied that Sarah had fabricated her story or exaggerated the details. Carter saw the sharp look of disbelief on Todd's face as the lawyer attempted to shift the blame, but Sarah remained firm, never faltering in her resolve. It was clear that no matter what Todd's lawyer threw at her, Sarah's truth was unshakable. Her courage was the final piece of evidence needed to seal Todd's fate. The trial continued with the presentation of further evidence, medical records, photographs, and witness statements that corroborated Sarah's account. The case against Todd grew stronger with each passing moment, and there was no longer any question in Carter's mind that Todd would be convicted. When the jury filed back into the courtroom after deliberation, the air was thick with anticipation. Carter held his breath as the foreman stood up to deliver the verdict. Every person in that room, from the judge to the reporters to the witnesses, waited for the moment that would bring this long, painful chapter to a close. "We the jury," the foreman began, his voice steady but somber, "find the defendant, Todd Carter, guilty on all charges." A wave of relief surged through the courtroom, and Carter exhaled sharply, his chest heavy with emotion. He had known it was coming, but hearing the words spoken out loud felt like the final release of all the tension and pain that had been building for so long. He turned his gaze towards Sarah, who was sitting quietly, her expression unreadable. He saw a glimmer of something in her eyes, an uncertain hope, perhaps, or the first flicker of peace since the nightmare had begun. Todd's reaction was more predictable. His face twisted in disbelief, his mouth slightly agape as he heard the verdict. The smug confidence he had once worn like armor was shattered, replaced by panic and rage. But it didn't matter anymore. The justice that had eluded Sarah for so long had finally been served. Todd's world was crumbling, and Sarah was free. As the judge called for a recess before sentencing, Carter stood and approached Sarah. He had been with her through every step of the investigation, but this moment felt different. This was her victory. "You did it," Carter said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "You got through it. You were incredible." Sarah gave him a faint, but genuine, smile. For the first time in a long time, there was a sense of relief in her eyes. "It's over," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Yeah," Carter replied, his heart swelling with pride for her. "It's over. You're free now." And with those words, Sarah Carter's long journey to healing truly began. The road ahead would still be difficult, but she had made it through the storm, and now the light at the end of the tunnel was within reach. The justice she deserved had been served, and she could finally close the door on the darkness that had defined so much of her life.